Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore, and welcome to Story Behind the Stone. In today's episode, we're joined by Dr. James Bulgin, PhD. He's the head of public history at the Imperial War Museums in the UK. With over 2 million visitors every year, we'll explore how the museums tell the complex stories of modern war and why telling individual stories is central to their galleries and to public history. James, thanks for joining the show and for the care and humanity that you bring to this important work. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Well, hello and welcome to Story Behind the Stone, a show where we talk service, sacrifice, and story, connecting you with the people changing the way the world remembers. I'm so pleased to be joined today by Dr. James Bulgin, PhD with the Imperial War Museums. He's the head of public history and the former head of content for the Holocaust Gallery at the Imperial War Museums. James, it's wonderful to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
There's so much ground to cover today with the broad remit that the Imperial War Museums has. If you could just give us a 30,000-foot view, tell us about the Imperial War Museums.
So the museum came to be by Act of Parliament in 1917 in the UK. Its founding was a direct product of the Battle of the Somme in the First World War and its aftermath. And there was this sense that it was such a seismic moment in the country's history that there needed to be some sort of formal organisation to kind of respond to it. And so this conversation evolved, and the museum was established by Act of Parliament in 1917, and its remit was going to be to cover the First World War. Initially, it was anticipated as being the National War Museum, and then conversations evolved at the time from people around the table saying, well, hang on a second, this was a war of empire, and it's right to acknowledge the contribution of people across the empire in pursuit of the war. And so that's why it became the Imperial War Museum at the kind of the outset. And the ambition was always that it should cover the experiences of people across society. It was never a museum that was just about kind of military endeavour or even a military museum at all. It was about the way that people across society and across the world had become a part of this thing. So that was what it was established to do, and it opened at the Crystal Palace in South London in 1920. And then when it moved in the 1930s, and then when the Second World War broke out in 1939, its remit was expanded to cover that. And after the Second World War, its remit was expanded to cover any conflict that involved Britain or countries of what then was the Commonwealth, because obviously the empire had ceased to exist by the late 1940s. So that's what it continues to do today. The remit continues to be to cover conflicts from the First World War to the present day that involve Britain or countries of the Commonwealth. And obviously we're actively in pursuit of that. But sometimes people wonder why we're not doing things before the First World War, and that's the answer.
James, tell us a little bit about the numbers. There's 5 sites. Tell us about the foot traffic that you're getting as well through those different sites.
The museum was initially founded in London, and as I say, moved to the Crystal Palace to the building that we're in now, which was formerly the St Bethlehem's Hospital. It grew, so now we have the London site, we have the Cabinet or the Churchill War Rooms, I should say, in central London. We also have the HMS Belfast, which is moored up on the Thames. In Cambridgeshire, we have Duxford, which is still an operational airfield. And then in Manchester, we have IWM North in Media City. So 5 sites, all of which have kind of different ambitions and roles. And across those sites, we have, obviously it varies year on year, and COVID has put a dent in the numbers whilst it was happening, a significant dent. We're over 2 million visitors a year across the sites. So relatively substantial number of people. And of course, we have visitors from across the world, and that's fantastic. And that's something that's really important to us, that we are a site that people come to when they come to this country.
You're used to, I'm sure, touring people around virtually and in person. When someone's coming from out of town, what's the first place that you take them to, or the first object that you take them to?
I suppose one object that always springs to mind for me is Tamzine, which is a boat that's on display in the Second World War galleries. It was the smallest of the little boats on Dunkirk. So it was this tiny little vessel, and it was donated to the museum, and it's been there ever since, and it's been on display virtually ever since. So that's an incredible piece of a physical trace of this really significant moment of the war. And it's one of those objects you stand next to and you think, how is it possible that this thing, this tiny little thing, was at the centre of this enormous historic event, and here I am next to it now.
As the head of public history, what's the primary problem that you're trying to solve?
I suppose the issue with history is that, particularly these days, in some respects, I sometimes wonder if we're in a bit of a competition for kind of historical veracity and accuracy, and kind of the rhetorical representations of history that appear in other places, and memory as well. A lot of our visitors enter the sites now, and their knowledge would have been substantively gleaned from films and TV programs and that sort of thing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But obviously, what we're then trying to do is to say, actually, that was a version of things, but that doesn't necessarily cover the whole picture. And so I suppose that's a big part of what we're trying to do. And also within that, there are lots of different ways of thinking about history. And I think as research continues and more things are revealed and the way that we think about things change, there is so much more to say. And that's a really important part of what we're trying to do, is to take things that are familiar and to say, but actually there is a much bigger picture that fits into. And that's complicated and it's challenging to deal with that complexity. And so I suppose that is our biggest issue. And then within that, there's a whole kind of raft of other issues. Obviously, maintaining the collection is a huge ongoing challenge for my colleagues in those teams. It's a huge collection that needs to be looked after, trying to keep an eye on what else we should be collecting to try and deal with people who want to donate things to us as well. That's a very kind of ongoing and active process. There's lots of things that we're trying to do, but for us, at the core of what we're trying to do is to ensure that visitors to us, whether that's physically coming onto the sites or coming onto our digital presence on our YouTube channels or on our website, etc., that they have an opportunity to develop their understanding of the way the 20th century conflict, and sadly now 21st century conflict, shapes who we are and ultimately, where we're going.
I visited the Bedlam site of the Imperial War Museums about 6 weeks ago. Entering the main atrium there, I was just struck by the physical objects on display. Tell us a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish at the museum with literally hanging rockets from the ceiling, I guess.
Those objects there are intended to kind of cover the breadth of the remit as a kind of an opening vista. There's a Neri gun from the First World War. There's a V2 rocket, as you say, from the Second World War. There's a Spitfire from the Second World War. And then there's objects that bring us right. There's a Harrier jump jet suspended from the ceiling. And then various different things from various different conflicts. There's a car. It's actually technically a work of art by Jeremy Deller called Baghdad Car, which is a car which was caught up in a car bombing in Baghdad. And so that's this kind of tortured, crushed metal entity. And that's really strong and important object. And then we've got, it's kind of viewable in that opening vista, things like, a section of one of the Twin Towers. So, trying to make this point that conflict takes many different forms and those who participate in it have many different identities as well. And so to establish that at the start is to kind of lay out our pitch for what we trying to do and why we think it's important.
I want to turn the lens, if it's okay. What got you inspired to work at the IDMM in the first place?
My undergraduate degree was in English, and then I went to drama school and trained as an actor and wanted to work in theatre and did work in theatre for about 10 or 15 years. Always had an interest in history. My father was really kind of interested in Second World War history, and so was I. And that was really kind of reinforced, funny enough, by seeing a film called Memphis Belle back in the 1990s, which is why I think that films do have a really important role to play in the way that we kind of come at history somehow. But anyway, so I had this interest in the background. And then whilst I was working in theatre, I was invited to go and see a new musical, which was set in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War. That led to me going back to university, not necessarily because I liked the show, I wasn't enormously fond of it, but it kind of got me really interested in this whole question about how we deal with history representationally, and particularly history as kind of vexing and complex and challenging as the Holocaust. And so I ended up doing a master's in the Holocaust, which went well, so I was invited to come back and do a PhD. And whilst I was doing that, I saw an opening at the museum. By that stage, I was in my mid-30s and I'd never worked in a museum. I'd never actually been employed. I'd always been self-employed. And I thought it kind of felt like it was an opportunity that was worth pursuing. So I was originally working in the publishing department briefly. And then this role came up to lead the creation of new Holocaust galleries. And I applied for that and got it. And that was just one of those huge life-changing moments, that just took me off on this completely different path. I completed the PhD whilst I was doing that. And then the galleries opened. And now I've kind of find myself as this person who's dealing with all these histories, and I feel very fortunate to be able to do so. But had you said to me in my early 1920s, or certainly as a teenager, this is what I would end up doing, I wouldn't have believed you.
What would your teenage self say about what you're doing right now?
I think my teenage self would be really pleased. I think they would be slightly incredulous, because it's like anything in life, sometimes the responsibility seems overwhelming, and it's never lost on me what a privilege is, genuinely isn't. And I could say the same for everyone I know at the museum. It's never lost on any of us what a privilege it is to do what we do, but also we take it incredibly seriously and we're very mindful of the responsibility. And my teenage self would kind of think on some level, wow, you turned into a proper grown up. And it does feel like that way. I do, particularly as somebody who's had quite extensive dealings with the history of the Holocaust and the places where it happened, and some of the people related, some of those who survived and the relatives to those who survived. The weight of that is significant. And I suppose my teenager self would think, wow, you've obviously changed quite a lot to get to a stage where that's something that you were able to do. But I think I'd have been really pleased to know that this is how it turned out in the end.
Tell us a little bit about the Holocaust galleries, and have you walked anyone through that has a link to the Holocaust?
The galleries themselves are were the product of around about 6-year project, and they were very much concerned with trying to represent the vast growth in research around the study of the Holocaust, and also to do something to respond to the paucity of public understanding, which various different research projects had kind of evidenced. So we were trying to find a way to present the subject differently in the hope that visitors would be given cause to think of it differently. The center of it was very much this ambition to present it as a history that was done by people to people, to move away from the idea that it was all about kind of a faceless, bureaucratic, industrialized machine, and to say actually this was very much about individual human endeavor. And moreover, the people that it affected weren't a kind of an anonymous mass. They were all individuals, and that was, really critical. And the most obvious elucidation of that, I suppose, from the get-go is that the galleries are light, or relatively light. They're not dark spaces. We wanted to say very clearly there is no inevitability about any of this. All of this is the product of individual human action. And that kind of informed every single thing we did. We were very fortunate that whilst we were working on the galleries, there were a number of survivors who were still with us, who were able to come in and talk to us and lead us through things. And it was a particularly affecting thing, actually, to then walk around with those people who we'd kind of been on this journey with, and to show them. And obviously they'd seen the renders because they'd been closely associated with some of them, but to kind of stand in the space with them was a really important thing. Very sadly, a number of those people have since passed away. And, that is a reality of the history of the Holocaust and the history of the Second World War, that those who lived it or, were able to survive it are few in numbers. And that number is tragically diminishing virtually by the day. So I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. And it really struck me after the galleries opened. Very sadly, one of the survivors that we dealt with passed away, and I got a message from her son saying, would you like to attend the funeral? And we did. It was during COVID, so it was online. But during his eulogy, he spoke about his mother's objects on display in the galleries and how much that meant to her. And I just thought, God, that's a really humbling thing to hear, because that woman had a very long and full life, just a really lovely human being. But the fact that for all of the things that she'd achieved, that was significant enough for her that it warranted being mentioned in her eulogy was something that really sat with me. And then a few months later, I was invited to another funeral, and sadly another one of the survivors we dealt with passed away. And on that instance, the family asked if I would read something at the funeral. And I thought, this is a very humbling thing to find oneself doing, to have set out to do this gallery that takes on this history, and then suddenly to find that your own personal identity is kind of intersected with these lives in such a way that it's worthy of being part of the most significant moments. And so it's kind of extraordinary, and obviously really value these ongoing relationships that we've had, and not now just with the survivors but also with their children, sometimes grandchildren too.
There's so many events that the IWM covers, and some of them are kind of passing out of our lived history in the sense that people are passing away. How are you approaching the challenge of memorializing or telling the story of war and events that still feel current for people, but for some that haven't lived it, how do you make it relevant to them? Like you said, they may not know what the Holocaust even was.
That is the kind of biggest challenge, I suppose, particularly for generations that are entirely removed. It can feel quite onerous, but actually I think in my experience, obviously we do an enormous amount of outreach. We have a lot of digital programming. We've got our YouTube channel that is done incredibly well. It's a fantastic team within the museum who work on that. And that's all concerned with getting the history and the collection and the objects in front of as many kind of people as possible. And obviously that can stretch beyond boundaries. And we've had, incredible numbers of views on some of those videos. So that on a really practical level, that's part of the strategy. We do learning programs in museums, which bring a lot of people through the doors. Our Holocaust learning program is enormously popular amongst schools, and huge numbers of people coming through. So all of those things really help. But I have to say that I think in my experience of speaking to young people, obviously it's anecdotal, and I wouldn't claim for a second that this representative of everything, but my experience of them is that actually they're really interested and they're really engaged and they really want to learn more. And so it's just a question of, doing that. And we're always looking at different ways of doing that. For example, for VJ Day this year, we worked with a group of fantastic young filmmakers who had just graduated from training, and they were just setting out into the world as, aspiring editors and animators and directors and composers. And we sat down with them and we gave them all of the museum's collections related to, or as many as we could make available to them digitally so that they could use it, related to the subject of the war in Asia and the Pacific, and said, look, we want to do a 2-minute piece here using all of these things. And and we're going to work with you to do that. But it was really important that they had creative freedom to do that. And then it was screened at various different screens across the country on VJ Day, and it was available across various different platforms. And that sort of thing, really, really strong. But I was so encouraged by them. They were all these amazing group of people in their early 20s, and they kind of on their own admission when they started, they said, I don't really know anything about this, but I really want to know something about it. I think that's the thing. I think there are strategies you can use, but I think sometimes there can be a slight danger of kind of underestimating these generations who are coming through and kind of underestimating the interest that they have. It's just a question of how you sort of frame content. And again, on a really practical level, the other thing about that for us is digitization. So obviously I'm speaking to you across an enormous stretch of water now, and it's really important to us that you as a visitor who's not in the UK can encounter the collections as much as you can. So again, on a practical level, that means digitizing as much as we possibly can. And that is a hugely involved endeavor. You know, we're just looking now at how we digitize in anticipation of the Second World War centenary. So even though that's still some, 15 years over the horizon, it's going to take that long to get as much as we can, because the museum's collections are vast, and the resource that's required to get them to the standard that it needs to be digitized and to get them on the website and collections online is a monumental endeavor. But we're on the case with that. I suppose that's another way that we can help to do that.
For those that are moved by the stories that the IWM holds and tells and the incredible digitization efforts that are coming, what's the most meaningful way that they can get involved, get engaged, and support your work?
Our website would always be, I would recommend, as the first port of call, iwm.org.uk. Obviously, it's easily findable on any search engines. And that is a useful portal for all the stuff we do. But I would also say our YouTube channel, we exist across most social media, but our YouTube channel, the team there have done an incredible job. I've done a few of those films with them, and they work with curators and historians across the organisation to root the history and the collections, but they're there, they're accessible, they're at the end of a click of a button, and get on there and have a look through those. They're uploading stuff all the time, and as I say, across the socials as well. And if you do come to the UK, you could do, if you're a visitor to London, the main museum down in Lambeth and the War Room and the War Rooms, the Church of War Rooms and the Belfast are all kind of walkable if you're feeling up for it, but it's within a contained space. And it's a fantastic way to encounter this history firsthand. And obviously I'm biased, but I would strongly recommend it.
For you specifically, what's the best place for folks to follow your work?
So I am on Instagram, Dr. James Bulgin Historian. That's my handle on Instagram. So please do, if you are interested. I'm always trying to up my game on Instagram and get more stuff up there. I've got a few media projects coming out this year of various different TV pieces and a couple of films I've been involved with. So I'll try and keep that updated, but that's the best first port of call.
Dr. James Bulgin, Head of Public History with the Imperial War Museums. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Wreaths Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. Thank you for tuning in.